Trapped between Putin's war and Trump's deadline, Zelensky faces the most impossible choice of the Ukraine conflict. The war in Ukraine has entered a brutally paradoxical phase. On the map, the front line moves slowly, village by village. In diplomacy, the ground is shifting far more quickly. While Russian artillery grinds forward near Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia, political pressure on Kyiv is now coming not only from Moscow but also from Washington. Between Vladimir Putin's long war and a controversial new U.S. peace plan, Volodymyr Zelensky today is caught in the narrowest political corridor of his presidency. 3 years after the Fuskal invasion, Russia still occupies roughly a fifth of Ukraine's territory. Russian forces have adapted to a long conflict, accepting extraordinary casualties in exchange for gradual territorial gains. Analysts estimate that Russian losses are approaching 1 million total casualties, including hundreds of thousands of dead, a scale that would be politically suicidal in most countries, but which the Kremlin absorbs through repression, propaganda, and a war narrative that portrays the conflict as existential. Russia's leadership behaves as if time, people, and money are painful, but renewable resources. On Tegrun, the initiative has slowly tilted Moscow's way. The fall of Avdiivka earlier this year, after a months-long siege, opened the door to further Russian advances towards Pokrovsk and placed additional pressure on Ukrainian lines in the Donbas. At the same time, renewed Russian offensive activity around Kharkiv and along parts of the Zaporizhzhia front has forced Kyiv to spread already thin forces across multiple axes. Where Ukraine once surprised the world with rapid, it is now mostly fighting defensive battles, trying to prevent a bad position from becoming a catastrophic one. Ukraine's problem is not simply tactical, it is structural. The country is under relentless missile and drone attack, especially against its energy grid. Emergency blackouts in cities like Kyiv and across major regions are no longer rare events, but a recurring feature of daily life. Each strike increases both the economic cost of the war and the psychological stress on the population. At the same time, Ukraine faces shortages in ammunition, air defense missiles, and perhaps most dangerously trained manpower. To sustain the fight, the government has had to push through unpopular mobilization measures, widening the call of pool in a society that has already sacrificed heavily. In Russia, Putin is also balancing on a knife's edge, but from a different position. Strategically, he believes he is winning. After surviving sanctions, domestic dissent, and battlefield failures, the Kremlin now sees a possibility to lock in territorial gains, weaken Ukraine permanently, and fracture Western unity. The Russian narrative is simple and brutal. Russia can fight as long as it must, and the West will eventually tire, especially if the cost in money and political capital keeps rising in Washington and European capitals. The recent peace talk theatrics have not changed that core calculation. They are an instrument of it. Putin's political goal remains what it was in 2022. A Ukraine that is territorially amputated, militarily constrained, and strategically neutralized. He wants not only land, but also a veto over Ukraine's future. A peace that freezes current front lines, recognizes Russian annexations, limits Ukraine's army, and blocks NATO membership would achieve much of what his army has failed to secure outright. For the Kremlin, a negotiated victory is still a victory. The battlefield and the conference table are simply two tools for the same objective. Zelensky faces the mirror image of that logic. For him, a bad peace is not peace at all. It is simply the next phase of the war, only later and from a weaker position. Yet he is under enormous pressure to at least consider precisely such a deal. The new 28-point peace plan pushed by the Trump administration forces Kyiv into an emotional and strategic dilemma. On paper, it offers Ukraine security guarantees and reconstruction funds. In practice, it asks Ukraine to accept deep territorial concessions, sharply reduce its army, renounce NATO membership, and live under the shadow of a Russia that would be diplomatically and economically reintegrated without truly being defeated. The plan has been presented with a deadline, turning diplomacy into a kind of political hostage situation. The message to Kyiv is blunt: accept this deal or risk losing US support while the war continues. For Zelensky, this transforms the question from what is a just peace into how much humiliation can Ukraine survive without losing the war by other means. He has described the current moment as one of the hardest for Ukraine, between losing territorial integrity and losing a crucial partner. That is not rhetoric. It is a brutally accurate summary of his choice set. Domestically, Zelensky is also more vulnerable than he was in the heroic early months of the war. Corruption scandals, especially around the energy sector and military procurement, have eroded trust among citizens who are already exhausted and grieving. Criticism of his inner circle, particularly of powerful figures in his office, has grown sharper. Wartime unity has not disappeared, but it is thinner. That makes any discussion of painful compromise even more explosive. A president who came to power on a message of renewal and anti-corruption now has to justify sacrifices to a public that increasingly wants clean governance as much as it wants victory. The international environment is just as complex. European leaders are openly uneasy about a peace formula that looks, too many of them, like a modernized version of the Minsk agreements, a frozen conflict that rewards aggression and leaves Ukraine permanently vulnerable. The EU's own emerging defense strategy assumes a long-term commitment to Ukraine as security and is built around the idea of turning Ukraine into a porcupine, a state well-armed and resilient to be invaded again. That vision does not sit easily alongside a plan that demands Ukrainian demilitarization and permanent neutrality. Yet Europe, for all its rhetorical support, still depends heavily on US political will and military stockpiles. Trump's approach has exposed this dependency by moving quickly and largely over European heads with a peace initiative that leans toward Russian demands. Washington has reminded Brussels that the center of gravity in this war remains American. At the same time, bipartisan voices in the US Congress and in European think tanks are warning that a lopsided agreement could undermine the entire post-Cold War security order, sending a message that nuclear-armed states can rewrite borders by force and still be welcomed back into the international system. In this triangle of pressure, Putin's long war, Trump's deadline diplomacy, and Europe's anxiety, Zelensky is trying to defend not just territory but also the meaning of Ukrainian sovereignty. For him, and for many Ukrainians, the war has always been about more than maps. It is about dignity, political agency, and the right to decide their own future. They remember that previous peace agreements with Russia did not end aggression, they merely paused it. Every cemetery filled since 2022 is a silent argument against trusting vague guarantees that depend on the goodwill of the same Kremlin that launched the invasion. At the same time, the battlefield reality cannot be ignored. Ukraine's ability to resist depends on continued external support. Without ammunition, air defense, and financial assistance, morale and courage alone cannot hold the line. This is the cruel logic of asymmetric partnerships. The smaller ally fights and dies, but the larger partners hold the keys to its long-term survival. Zelensky knows that if he rejects a US-backed plan too bluntly, he risks being blamed for prolonging the war, even though the invasion was not of his making. Putin, for his part, is watching all this with cold attention. Every visible crack between Kyiv and its allies is a strategic gain for Moscow. The more the debate in the West shifts from how do we help Ukraine win to how do we get out of this, the more leverage he has. If he can force Ukraine into accepting a deal that locks in Russian gains and Ukrainian sovereignty, and get that deal stamped as peace by Washington, he will have achieved a major geopolitical victory without needing a decisive battlefield breakthrough. This is why the coming weeks matter so much. They will not by themselves end the war, but they could decide whether the conflict moves toward a fair settlement that protects Ukraine's sovereignty or toward a coerced ceasefire that merely freezes injustice. For Zelensky, the question is not simply whether to sign or refuse a particular document. It is whether any agreement can be reached that does not betray the sacrifices of his people. For Putin, the question is whether he can convert battlefield attrition and Western fatigue into strategic success. And for the rest of the world, the outcome will be a signal. Either that borders in Europe are protected by law and collective security, or that, in the end, power and patience belong to those willing to destroy more and wait longer. Ukraine's war has always been larger than Ukraine. Now, in the shadow of new peace plans and old ambitions, that truth is clearer than ever.